you going with that ward healer?
To the palace roof, and don't you be a heel. Don't worry, we won't even be seen. I'll get a private dining room or something.
And I say you won't. I'm running this show, and I'm running it till the tour is over.
There's something about old Hollywood that still feels almost unreal. The glamour, the larger-than-life personalities, the sense that these people existed in a different world altogether. And in many ways, they did. But behind all that shimmer, some of the biggest names of the era had stories that ended somewhere far darker than the silver screen. Today, we're counting down 10 Golden Age stars who went from fame to prison. Number 10. Mae West. Long before she became Hollywood's most quotable woman, Mae West was already a professional troublemaker, and she wore it like a badge of honor. Born in Brooklyn in 1893, West started in vaudeville as a teenager, performing as young as 7 years old in local church shows and amateur productions before graduating to the professional circuit. She was one of those rare people who seemed to have been born knowing exactly who she was: brash, funny, open in ways that made audiences gasp and then laugh. And from early on, she was determined to use the stage not just to entertain, but to say things that polite society would prefer went unsaid. She eventually made her way to Broadway, where she had a taste for pushing every limit the stage would allow. By 1926, she had written, produced, and starred in a play simply called which at the time was essentially a declaration of war against the censors. The play had no major backers and no big theater behind it. West financed it herself, staged it herself, and performed the lead herself. It ran for more than 350 performances in New York, drawing enormous crowds and equally enormous outrage from civic and religious groups who believed it was dangerous, degrading, and an insult to public decency. Police eventually raided the theater in February 1927, and West, along with members of the cast and crew, was arrested on charges of obscenity and corrupting public morals. The arrest was front-page news across the city, which, given the audience West was after, was probably not the disaster it was intended to be. She was convicted and sentenced to 10 days in the workhouse on Welfare Island in New York. Mae West, already one of the most recognizable personalities in the city, did not collapse into shame. She showed up in her own clothes, charmed the prison warden so thoroughly that he reportedly dined with her in his office, and left the experience not humiliated, but somehow more famous than she had been going in. She later said she wore silk underwear throughout her sentence, and that the warden called her May instead of using a prison number. 2 days were eventually knocked off her sentence for good behavior. When she got out, the story only added to her mystique. She continued writing plays and performing through the late 1920s, and then in 1932, she made the move to Hollywood that would turn her into a genuine American icon. Her career in the early 1930s was extraordinary. Films like She Done Him Wrong and I'm No Angel, both released in 1933, were massive box office successes that arrived at exactly the right moment. The Depression had audiences desperate for entertainment that was alive, funny, and refused to pretend life was simple. She was so financially powerful in that brief window that Paramount Pictures credited her output with genuinely saving the studio from bankruptcy. The numbers were real. Her pictures were among the studio's most profitable of the period, and she was earning a salary that put her among the highest paid entertainers in America. The censors eventually caught up with her through the Hays Production Code, which was enforced much more rigorously from 1934 onward. The kind of material West had built her brand on, double entendres, frank. The suggestion that women might enjoy life on their own terms became increasingly difficult to get past the censors. Her films grew more constrained, and by the late 1930s and into the 1940s, she was working in a Hollywood that had decided it no longer wanted what she was selling, at least not in those terms. She returned to stage work and continued performing into old age, never quite losing the persona that had made her famous. She died in 1980 at the age of 87, still herself to the end. Number 9. Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle. By 1921, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the most beloved comedy stars in the world. He had been making films since 1909, first at Keystone Studios alongside Charlie Chaplin, and later as a headlining star in his own right. His physical comedy was extraordinary, agile, inventive, and genuinely funny in ways that still hold up when you watch them today. He was earning $1 million a year from Paramount, which was an almost unimaginable sum at the time, and he had just signed what was, at the moment, the largest contract in Hollywood history. story. 3 years, $3 million. The ink had barely dried. Then Labor Day weekend of 1921 happened, and everything fell apart. Arbuckle hosted a party over 3 days at the Hotel St. Francis in San Francisco. A young actress named Virginia Rapp became severely ill during the party and died 4 days later from a ruptured bladder. A woman at the party, Bambina Maud Delmont, accused Arbuckle of assaulting Rapp, and almost immediately the press, led by William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, turned the story into a feeding frenzy. The coverage was lurid and relentless, and Arbuckle's name was destroyed before he ever set foot in a courtroom. Hearst's papers ran front pages with accusations presented as established facts, and public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. He stood trial 3 times. The first 2 ended in hung juries. The third, in April 1922, resulted in an acquittal, and not just a simple not guilty. The jury issued a written statement, which was nearly unheard of at the time, explicitly stating that Arbuckle had been the victim of a great injustice and that there was not a scrap of evidence connecting him to any wrongdoing. They apologized to him directly in writing. It didn't matter. His films had already been pulled from circulation, banned by theater owners across the country in response to the public pressure. His career was effectively over. Will Hayes, the newly appointed film industry censor, initially banned Arbuckle from the screen entirely. He spent years directing films under a pseudonym, William Goodrich, while the man who had once been Paramount's biggest star was locked out of the spotlight he had built. Friends in the industry tried to help him quietly behind the scenes, but the public image was irreparable. He did eventually get a contract to make a series of sound comedy shorts in 1932 and 1933, and those who worked with him during that period said he was in good spirits, hopeful that the comeback was real. He died of a heart attack in his sleep in June 1933, just 1 day after signing the contract. He was 46 years old. While Arbuckle himself was never imprisoned, his story belongs here because it tells us something essential about the era. He was held under the punishing machinery of the legal system for over a year, tried 3 times for something the jury unanimously agreed he did not do, and his life was destroyed not by a conviction, but by the tabloid machinery that had already decided the verdict before the trial began. Number 8. Billie Holiday. Billie Holiday was one of the greatest jazz and blues singers who ever lived. She had a voice that carried a weight most people spend their whole lives trying to put into words, and a phrasing so distinctive that no one before or since has sounded quite like her. She began recording in the early 1930s, first with Benny Goodman, and then through a remarkable series of small group recordings with Teddy Wilson and Lester Young in the mid-1930s that are still considered among the finest jazz recordings ever made. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, she was a genuine star, performing in clubs and concert halls, recording for major labels, and becoming one of the defining voices of American music. In 1939, she began performing Strange Fruit, a song about the lynching of black men in the American South, which she would sing at the end of her shows, the room silent and the lights dim. It was a song that made people deeply uncomfortable, which was precisely the point. The federal government, specifically the Bureau of Narcotics under Harry Anslinger, took notice of Holiday, not only for her drug use, which was real and serious, but because Anslinger believed that a famous black woman performing politically charged material represented a danger that needed to be contained. She had been fighting a heroin addiction that had taken hold in the early 1940s, and that addiction was the lever the government used against her. In May 1947, Holiday was arrested in a hotel room in Philadelphia on narcotics charges. She waived her right to a jury trial and pleaded guilty, reportedly on the advice of people around her who told her it was the fastest path to getting treatment. What she got instead was a sentence of a year and a day at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia. She served 9 months before being released on good behavior in March 1948. The consequences went well beyond the time served. Upon her release, she could not get her New York City cabaret performer's card renewed. Because of her conviction, she was barred by city law from performing in any venue that served alcohol. In a city where the major jazz clubs were the primary venues for the music, that restriction was devastating. She was forced to perform at Carnegie Hall and similar concert spaces rather than the clubs and rooms where jazz actually lived and where her career had been built. She appealed repeatedly to have the card restored and was refused every time. She continued recording throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, and her later recordings, especially the albums she made for Verve in the mid-1950s, are considered some of the most emotionally raw and honest singing ever committed to tape. But the government's campaign against her did not stop. She was arrested again in 1956 in Philadelphia and again in 1958. In May 1959, as she lay dying of liver failure and heart disease in Metropolitan Hospital in New York, federal agents appeared at her hospital room door. She was arrested on narcotics possession charges from her hospital bed, handcuffed to the railing, and her belongings, including flowers sent by friends, were confiscated. A guard was posted at her door. Billie Holiday died in July 1959 at the age of 44. She had 70 cents in the bank and $750 in cash strapped to her leg, money a friend had brought her. The decades since her death have only deepened her reputation. She is widely considered one of the most important vocalists in the history of American music, and the story of how the justice system treated her is inseparable from the story of who she was. Number 7. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was not yet the chairman of the board when he made his first visit to a jail cell. He was 22 years old, still playing the Hoboken club circuit, still largely unknown outside New Jersey, and apparently more charming than he was wise. In November 1938, Sinatra was arrested in Bergen County, New Jersey, on a morals charge. The initial charge stated he had seduced a woman of good repute under a promise of marriage, which, in the laws of the time, was a criminal offense in New Jersey. He was booked and briefly jailed. The charge was subsequently amended when it emerged that the woman in question was actually married, which changed the nature of the alleged offense under the statute. He was then charged with adultery. That charge too was eventually dropped, and Sinatra paid a nominal fine and was released. He spent a very short time behind bars, more a night in a cell than anything that could be described as imprisonment, and the whole episode was quickly forgotten by almost everyone involved. It is a footnote in his biography that he actively disliked having brought up in later years. But the reason it belongs in this conversation is what came right after it. Sinatra went from that embarrassing arrest into one of the most remarkable rises in the history of American popular entertainment. By 1942, he had left Tommy Dorsey's band and gone solo, and within months, he was causing genuine crowd hysteria. Teenagers, mostly girls, fainting and screaming at his performances at the Paramount Theater in New York in ways that genuinely baffled and alarmed the press. His vocal talent was extraordinary, but so was the timing. America was at war, and there was something in the way Sinatra sang ballads, intimate, almost conversational, that connected with people in a way that the more orchestrated, popular singing of the era had not. Then his career stalled in the late 1940s, and for a few years it seemed like he might not recover. His voice was giving him trouble, his marriage was falling apart, and his public profile had become complicated. He came back in 1953 with a role in From Here to Eternity that nobody expected him to get, and that almost nobody expected him to be good in. He was good in it. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor that year and returned to the recording studio with Capitol Records, where he made a series of albums across the mid to late 1950s, Songs for Young Lovers, In the Wee Small Hours, Only the Lonely, Come Fly With Me, that are still held up as some of the most sophisticated popular music ever recorded. The 1938 arrest sat quietly in the background through all of it. His associations with organized crime figures throughout his life, documented, rumored, and extensively investigated over the decades, gave writers and journalists far larger material to work with than a youthful indiscretion in New Jersey. That early brush with the law never defined him, though it perhaps hinted at something that ran through his entire life, a belief that the rules that applied to other people were negotiable when it came to Frank Sinatra. Number 6. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer is one of the most heartbreaking figures in the history of Hollywood. She arrived in the late 1930s as a genuinely gifted actress, intense, intelligent, politically outspoken, and utterly unwilling to play the docile star that the studio system wanted her to be. She worked in films and on Broadway and earned real critical praise, but her refusal to cooperate with studio demands, her leftist politics, and her increasingly volatile personal behavior made her a target. The legal troubles started in 1942. She was stopped by police in Santa Monica for a minor traffic violation and was arrested after failing to comply with wartime blackout regulations. After that arrest, she allegedly assaulted a police officer, and things unraveled quickly. She was taken into custody, appeared in court in a notoriously chaotic hearing where she was visibly distressed and combative, and was sent first to a psychiatric ward, and then, in January 1943, to the psychiatric security ward of the Los Angeles General Hospital. She was subsequently transferred in 1945 to the Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington, where she was committed against her will and remained for several years. She was subjected to the standard treatments of the era, which included hydrotherapy and insulin shock therapy. There are accounts, disputed but widely repeated, that she was also subjected to a transorbital lobotomy, though no definitive documentation has confirmed this. Farmer was released in 1950 and spent the 1950s trying to rebuild her life. She eventually worked as a television host in Indianapolis in the early 1960s and made a modest Hollywood comeback. She wrote a memoir, Will There Really Be a Morning?, which was published after her death from esophageal cancer in 1970. Whether her commitment was a genuine medical response or a punitive one, driven by a system that simply did not know what to do with a woman who refused to comply, has been debated for decades. What is clear is that the combination of arrests, institutionalization, and forced commitment took everything from her. She went into the system as one of the most promising actresses of her generation, and came out of it as someone who spent years quietly trying to survive. Number 5. Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry is, by any reasonable measure, one of the architects of rock and roll. He recorded a string of records in the mid to late 1950s that established the grammar of the genre, the guitar riffs, the storytelling, the teenage themes, and virtually every band that came after him acknowledged the debt. The Beatles covered him. Keith Richards called him the greatest rock and roll songwriter who ever lived. He was inducted into the first class of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986. He also went to prison, more than once. The first time was before his fame. In 1944, at the age of 17, he was convicted of armed robbery in the course of a cross-country joyride gone badly wrong, and was sentenced to the Intermediate Reformatory for Young Men at Algoa, Missouri, where he served 3 years. The second time had far larger consequences for his career. In 1959, at the height of his fame, Berry was charged under the Federal Mann Act, which prohibited the transportation of women across state lines for immoral purposes. In connection with a 14-year-old Apache girl named Janice Escalante, he had hired to work as a hat check attendant at his nightclub in St. Louis. His first trial was declared a mistrial due to racially prejudicial remarks made by the judge. A second trial in 1961 resulted in a conviction, and Berry was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. He served approximately 20 months at the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, before being released in October 1963. The timing could not have been worse. He was released just as Beatlemania was beginning to reshape the pop music landscape, and while the British invasion bands were citing him as a foundational influence, Berry himself was trying to get his career back on track from a prison cell. He did manage to return. His career had genuine moments of resurgence in the 1960s and beyond, but the years he lost during what should have been his commercial peak were gone. He was convicted again in 1979 for income tax evasion, serving 4 months at Lompoc Federal Prison Camp in California. He continued performing until shortly before his death in March 2017 at the age of 90. Number 4. Rory Calhoun. In the 1950s, Rory Calhoun was a Western movie star, tall, dark, handsome, rugged in exactly the way the genre required. He appeared in more than 80 films over the course of his career, showed up in 2 Marilyn Monroe movies, How to Marry a Millionaire and River of No Return, and starred in his own television series, The Texan, which ran from 1958 to 1960. He had a genuine screen presence and a natural ease in the saddle that made him a reliable draw at the Saturday afternoon matinee. What the fan magazines of the era carefully avoided mentioning was what had come before all of that. Born Francis Timothy McCown in Los Angeles in 1922, Calhoun had a chaotic early life. His father died when he was an infant, his mother remarried, and his stepfather was physically abusive. By the time he was 13, he was stealing firearms and was sent to the California Youth Authority Reformatory at Ione, California. He escaped, was recaptured, and the cycle of offenses continued. Car theft, burglary, armed robbery at jewelry stores. When he stole a car and drove it across state lines, that made it a federal offense. He was sentenced to 3 years at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, and then transferred on additional charges to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained until he was paroled just before his 21st birthday in 1943. What changed his trajectory was a prison priest, variously identified in accounts as Father Donald Canali or Father John Canali, who took an interest in the young man, introduced him to boxing, and gave him what Calhoun later described as his first experience of genuine respect. After his release, Calhoun drifted through a series of jobs before a chance meeting on horseback in the Hollywood Hills with actor Alan Ladd changed everything. Ladd's wife, Sue Carroll, was a talent agent. She arranged a screen test, and within a year, Calhoun had a contract with David O. Selznick and a new name. His past stayed buried for more than a decade. Then, in 1955, his own agent, Henry Wilson, deliberately leaked the story to Confidential magazine as a diversionary tactic, trading Calhoun's past to protect another client, Rock Hudson, from a story about his private life. The resulting exposé detailed the arrests, the reformatory, San Quentin, everything. Instead of ending Calhoun's career, the revelation barely dented it. Studios decided the story fit his bad boy image, and he kept working. He died in 1999 at the age of 76. Number 3. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum was, by 1948, one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. He had come up through B Pictures and wartime films, earned an Academy Award nomination for The Story of G.I. Joe in 1945, and by the late 1940s was RKO's leading man, laconic, physical, effortlessly cool, in a way that the camera seemed to love without quite being able to explain. He was earning $3,000 a week, which at the time was exceptional. His films were making money. On the night of August 31st, 1948, Mitchum was at a house in Laurel Canyon with a handful of acquaintances, including actress Lila Leeds, when Los Angeles police detectives burst in. He was smoking a marijuana cigarette. The press was already waiting at the police station when they arrived. The arrest, as investigations later confirmed, had been staged by the LAPD as a publicity stunt to promote the department's anti-drug campaign. The police had been tipped off about Mitchum's whereabouts and timed the raid for maximum press visibility. Mitchum pleaded no contest and was sentenced to 2 years of probation and 60 days in jail. He served 50 days, split between the Los Angeles County Jail and the Sheriff's Honor Farm in Castaic, California, and was released on March 30th, 1949. Life magazine photographers were permitted inside to photograph him mopping up in his prison uniform. Mitchum, characteristically, told reporters that jail was like Palm Springs, but without the riffraff. His studio, RKO, chose to stand by him. In January 1951, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office reopened the case, found evidence that the arrest had indeed been a setup, and overturned the conviction. The reversal received almost no press attention. As for his career, it continued as if the arrest had barely happened. Rachel and the Stranger, the first film released after his conviction, became one of RKO's top grossers of 1948. By the end of the decade, he was more established than ever, going on to make Cape Fear, The Night of the Hunter, Heaven Knows, Mr. Allison, and a string of films that cemented his reputation as one of the great actors of his generation. The arrest, in a very strange way, deepened the persona rather than destroying it. Number 2. Spade Cooley. If you came of age in Southern California in the 1940s, you almost certainly knew who Spade Cooley was. He was the king of Western swing, his self-appointed title, and by the standards of the time, not an unreasonable one. Born Donald Clyde Cooley in Oklahoma in 1910 and partly of Cherokee descent, he had come to California with his fiddle and almost nothing else, worked his way into the dance hall circuit, and by the mid-1940s was leading one of the most popular bands in the country. His 18-month engagement at the Venice Pier Ballroom drew thousands every Saturday night. He appeared in 38 Western films, often as a stand-in for Roy Rogers. He hosted his own television variety show, broadcast from Santa Monica, which at its peak was drawing an audience of 75,000 viewers a week. He had a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and then, on the night of April 3rd, 1961, he beat his wife, Ella Mae Evans, to death at their ranch near Willow Springs, California. He was 50 years old. She was 36. Their marriage had been deteriorating for some time. Cooley was drinking heavily, mixing alcohol with Thorazine, and was consumed by jealousy over his wife's alleged affairs. When she told him she wanted a divorce, things became catastrophic. The murder was witnessed by their 14-year-old daughter, Melody, who was forced to watch and who later testified at trial about what she saw. Cooley was indicted by a Kern County grand jury on April 26, 1961, and convicted of first-degree murder on August 21st, 1961. He was sentenced to life in prison. The trial was the longest in Kern County history at that point, and the testimony from his own daughter was devastating. He proved to be a model prisoner at the California Men's Colony at Vacaville and was granted a parole hearing in August 1969, with the state board voting unanimously to release him effective February 1970. Before his release date arrived, he was given a 72-hour furlough in November 1969 to perform at a benefit concert for the Alameda County Deputy Sheriff's Association in Oakland. The performance was the first he had given in nearly a decade. He received a standing ovation. During intermission, backstage, Spade Cooley suffered a massive heart attack and died. He never left prison alive. His parole was 2 months away. It was one of the stranger endings in American entertainment history. A man who had once packed dance halls across Southern California, dying on a stage in Oakland after nearly a decade behind bars, a standing ovation still ringing in his ears. Number 1. James Brown. Long before the world called him the godfather of soul, before the superhuman energy that defined his performances, before the recordings that would influence virtually every genre of popular music that came after him, James Brown was a teenager in Augusta, Georgia, with almost nothing and very few options. No money, no safety net, no real path forward that anyone was offering him. Just the street, the church, and whatever he could scrape together on his own. Born in 1933 in South Carolina, he grew up in poverty that was genuinely severe. He was largely raised by an aunt who ran a brothel in Augusta, shined shoes, picked cotton, and did whatever was available to scrape by. At 15, in 1948, he was arrested for breaking into cars and stealing clothing from them. He was convicted of felony counts of breaking and entering and intent to steal, and sentenced to 8 to 16 years in the Georgia Juvenile Training Institute. He served 3 years working the fields and performing in the prison's gospel choir before being released on parole in 1952. The parole came largely because of the sponsorship of Bobby Bird, a young musician who had seen Brown perform and agreed to take responsibility for him. It was through Bird that Brown found his way into music seriously. They formed a group, the Flames, which eventually became James Brown and the Famous Flames. By 1956, he had his first hit. By the early 1960s, he was one of the most electrifying performers in America. By the mid-1960s, he was performing multiple shows a night on the Chitlin circuit, defining what would become funk, and playing a central role in shaping black popular culture. His 1963 live album, Live at the Apollo, is one of the most important recordings in American music history. His legal troubles came back in 1988 after a high-speed, multi-state car chase across South Carolina and Georgia that involved police officers and eventually a shotgun, which Brown denied firing. He was arrested and convicted of aggravated assault with intent to kill and failure to stop for a blue light. He was sentenced to 6 years in the State Park Correctional Center in Columbia, South Carolina. He served approximately 2 years before being released on parole in February 1991. There were also long-standing allegations of domestic violence that surrounded his personal life for much of his later career, which added a complicated layer to his legacy. He died in December 2006 at the age of 73. The 3 years he spent in the Georgia Juvenile Training Institute could have ended his story before it began. Instead, they happened to be 3 years before everything that followed. The music, the influence, the records, the performances that people are still talking about decades later. These stories don't all fit the same shape, and that's part of what makes them worth thinking about. Some of the people on this list went to prison before they were famous. Rory Calhoun was a teenage criminal long before anyone in Hollywood knew his name, and James Brown did 3 years in a juvenile facility before he ever set foot on a stage professionally. Their incarceration in those cases was something they carried into their careers rather than something that interrupted them. Others, Robert Mitchum, Chuck Berry, Billie Holiday, were caught up in legal systems that were being used in ways that had at least as much to do with politics, race, or publicity as with genuine justice. Spade Cooley is the tragedy on this list, a man whose violence destroyed 2 lives in a single night, his wife's and his own, and who died before the parole that was coming had even arrived. And Frances Farmer is perhaps the most sobering case of all, because what happened to her had the least to do with a courtroom, and the most to do with a system that decided a difficult woman was a problem to be solved by institutionalization. Mae West and Frank Sinatra are the outliers, people for whom the brush with the law was brief enough that it barely slowed them down, and who went on to careers that dwarfed the original incident in every way. But even their stories are reminders that the golden age of Hollywood, for all its carefully constructed glamour, was full of human beings who did not always behave like the characters they played. The era produced some of the most enduring entertainment in human history. It also produced these stories, and somehow the two things belong together. The shimmer and the shadow, inseparable from each other. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. We cover the real stories behind the golden age of Hollywood, the careers, the scandals, the music, and the people who built it all. And there is always more to tell. Leave a comment below with which of these stories hit you the hardest. We read every one of them.